Hello everyone, today we talk about Catharism, right? Not the first time we do it, there are other videos out there, including one styled Catharism, where I still made videos like with single title because I hadn't made multiple ones on the same subject, and I don't know how I'm going to title this, but I try essentially to enucleate what Catharism was per se, right? So as a broader movement, ideology, sometimes a doctrine. It was a very complex thing, and historiographically speaking, we are essentially stressing today the work of let's say identification and and manipulation of the idea of Catharism from the hand at the hands of the Roman Church, as if Catharism had never existed per se, but it was just like an invention, a creation, a fabrication to justify a very important political and social upheaval in Occitania and what this entailed at the time. I have personally, I know I'm growing contrarian. People say, "Oh, you're not objective anymore, and you always have your bias, and you put politics in these things." And frankly, I must say that there is actually a great degree of objectivity that I came to this point. I'm not really struggling to realize certain things historically. They just come natural immediately in the moment in which I read what they were fundamentally about. And not only I believe in the fact that Catharism existed as such, and that the Cathars were a real threat to the universal unity of say Western civilization at the time, with all the due approximations in this, but they were also something extremely dangerous in general to properly the universal human values, I believe, and identify in this movement, frankly, lots of features that are historically very frequently repeating themselves in fringe situations in certain particular political social conditions, and actually that have a lot to do with even what is happening just nowadays in terms of certain radical ideologies. And I wouldn't feel like an objective historian if I didn't judge on that pattern, right? What's the point of making history pretending that it's just detached from any kind of context, even in the moment in which history is properly done, right? When we actually try to sort out, to explain what is going on, because it's very easy to say, okay, well, just talk about facts, right? And just presume that history is about facts, and that basically there is an historical dimension that is unbiased, and that we just have to recover it, so that's the right one, and all the rest is nonsense. This is, scientifically speaking, morally speaking, nonsense itself, right? There is no such thing like a biased history. There's never been, and this is not a fault of history or historians or the cultures that produced that. This is the absolute condition of history. There is no history without bias, because without bias there wouldn't even be the reason to make history. So there is never been, and there will never be, in human civilization, any form of unbiased history, thank God. And those who think actually that this is possible, it's because they haven't gotten much themselves into, which is normal, what history is concretely about. Again, this is a normal bias. Biases have different, scale of value, right? Just like any human action, right? So being biased is not by default an invalidation. So the problem is, see what this bias is, what kind of method he has used. Has any scientific substance, or is it just I decide so because of no evidence. So it doesn't mean anything. But it's normal nowadays to presume that history is just a story, and that again there is the cool, real, objective, right, story that the evil people are going to hide you because they are biased, and there is no change in that, or at least even when there is, it's just adding new pure facts, right, 100% true, right, because we use every time at this point in any historical context I see the word truth or true used, I immediately get almost like a syncope or something. But aside from that, I care about the fact that this interpretation does stem from, say, from what I think about the Cathars, etc., and what I've seen, from what I consider at this point of my life, of my career, of my experience from many different ways, like the one I do. And so I wouldn't consider myself as useful, given that I also come from at least, my formal education actually is not just it's not just about the title that I have, or that I never throw around, or the place where I actually achieved this, and when and the results that I brought on a scientific level, but properly it's the broader experience that brought me to achieve that. It makes me realize that yes, it's normal that somebody, and even many people, and legitimately, will see this as something like hopelessly biased and subjective. Again, I believe it's wrong, properly as a vision of the world, of history, of science, of morality, and I have no problems with that in regard. And I say this in an absolutely friendly sense, meaning that it's not that I think that a person says, well, this is biased, I think these people are stupid. It's just, I think it's normal to be at that point when, you take certain paths, and you don't expose yourself to certain problems. It's absolutely normal, right? So I'm very sympathetic towards this, because I was there too at some point in my life, right? And so surprisingly enough, what happened is that the more I, went on, right? I was, say, let's put it in this way, I was biased, like as you can be as a kid when you don't know the world that much, and when you're young, this is a normal cognitive experience. Like you need to become an iconoclast in a way. You need to be a bit Cathar yourself, and then because you need to make sense of the world at that point, you're meant to do that. But then when you go on, you start building again, right? Something that has also to stand on its feet. But in my opinion, not much of the bias that I had before, that I completely detached from in part, but other bias and others that came about, right? Has further consolidated and solidified, because it's always susceptible to change, right? If you prove me wrong and with some sound scientific evidence, I say, okay, well, yes, that's also a common experience. But the question is, there should be at least a proof of this. And so I'm making all this introduction now. You may think I'm just making the video longer, like the videos longer like that. And I don't know whether the audience likes me. Some people can't stand my ramble. I know since the beginning there's somebody, no, you don't get to the point. These videos are meant to be like that, right? The whole channel is like that. So, if people follow, it's because evidently they, at the end of the day, either they can't tolerate me in these things, and or I don't think that it's because they're going to dig to, to the, what they think that there are the absolute facts, right, in the midst of this broader presentation. But I actually want to be quite precise in this video, because that's the important theoretical point, in fact, of Catharism in itself. So recently, I could add more, but let's leave it for later, maybe. And I will, by the way, also to counterbalance my views, but offer some criticism to the same. That is to say, can we salvage something from Catharism? Of course, right? Because in fact, as I was just saying, yes, it is true that it wasn't a unitary, sclerotized, crystallized thing, right? It was actually a very complex phenomenon, especially by scale already should make you realize the importance of it and the potential threat that it posed when we actually realized what it revolved around, in fact, in belief, right, and as a broader cultural, meaning at that point. I say cultural for not saying, in fact, something greater, which was in fact metaphysical in nature. And also historiography hasn't helped historically to frame these events in quite a correct light most of the times. You will see why. Today we don't talk about the Albigensian Crusade, by the way, but maybe some reference about it will also help to clarify some point. We'll make that another, we will talk about the Albigensian Crusade, which I still haven't done in a unique video, but I will at some point, even multiple ones. So recently we have seen the Catarian movement. Even about that we made a couple of videos. You can search in medieval Christianity. I'm planning to create a medieval heresy playlist, by the way, so to be completely in the open, under the sun, relatively to what I think about that. And we've seen, what was essentially the cultural, the political, social background from which the instances of church reformation had stemmed from. Maybe we'll make a video soon properly stressing that even broader dimension that went beyond the same Gregorian reforms, the same, in fact, opposition to it. And it was inscribable in a broader moral revival of Western Europe after the early Middle Ages that brought to a remarkably varied set of religious experiences that we can identify in mysticism, in asceticism, in millenarism. We will talk about them all. The Catarian movement, as we've seen, had fundamentally asked for a religious reform, spiritual reform of the church, and especially resuming also ancient problems that had already been present in Christianity since antiquity. Think about Donatism, the problem of the validity of the sacraments when administered by an unfit priest, and so on. And these were obviously intertwined with very concrete and really non-spiritual, at least in a strictly theological sense, political and social interests. We have seen how the Milanese situation had produced the Papacy as such properly was imminently a prelude to the investiture controversy. Essentially, the Milanese wanted to eliminate, right, for sake of greater autonomy, an important part of imperial interference through that manifested itself through the policy of the bishop's counts in the city and in general, right, wherever you talk about in the various kingdoms of the empire and so on. And that was played by the papacy by saying, yes, we do need, and so the main criticism was about, in fact, the simony of the church, the idea that all those offices were fundamentally bought, because the clergy was essentially of the same paste, politically and socially and culturally, of the secular elite. They came from the same families that were fundamentally nobiliar military ones. It was the same clergy was often militarized, especially in certain areas of Europe, and at that point, at the beginning of the 11th century, still the upper hand of the secular authority, so the empire, was on the church, on the appointments, right, in offices appointments, was quite present, right. The Roman papacy was beginning to autonomize itself, had received since the beginning of the century, especially thanks to Schwerpunkt, this universalistic and properly Roman understanding of its role in the world, etc., whereas the empire was facing with ever greater problems. So the Papacy had, in a sense, been a manifestation of that, loss of ground from the imperial side, and the papacy had infiltrated in these movements to boost the spiritual reform. But when the imperial representatives were somewhat getting, were taken away, same papacy fundamentally took the place in an aristocratic form, with important difference that objectively, yes, now the church was fundamentally ruled by itself, not by a secular authority. This brought important, differences, especially in the fact that, I don't know, the secular authority, for example, can, let's say, the interference was bringing to a more centralized system from the papal side than was essentially the secular one. And in a way, the Patharians were discontented because of this result, because the church was still a pretty secular power in nature, and we have seen that this was also another, all physical necessity. There can't be any human community without a kind of temporal power in order to do anything, including property and so on. And we know how things went, and the papal monarchy developed, and it began to acquire ever greater prerogatives, and essentially there were many discontents among those who had supported the reform in that regard. Others said, well, that's fundamentally okay, because at least in terms of imperial-papal relations, things have balanced out, and that would be even, especially in the first phase of the, after the first phase of the investiture struggle with the Treaty of Worms in 1122. Others simply said, no, like the eternal discontent, right? Saying, the church is still corrupt, is always corrupt as long as it has property and is, it's a power, it's just an expression of evil, something like that. It's useless to say that these were somewhat fringe movements, as always. Like if you look at any kind of civilization, you look at this in Christianity, look at it in Islam, you look at in all the, let's say, great, in all the great civilizations, this is not to do with religions themselves, meaning that it's a meta-religious problem. There is always an orthodox and then an heterodox that always kind of work in the same ways, right? Orthodoxy stresses need for, authority, discipline, order, and it fundamentally stands from the side of the majority. And the fringe is like more radical. It's, if you want, even more challenging from a merely philosophical point of view. Factually, it doesn't accomplish much, if not maintaining orthodoxy aware of it, preventing from its sclerotization. So it's actually probably an evolutionary necessity in communities for which we do need extremism in small doses for a healthy civilization to exist in the first place. What, let's say, in the 21st, in the 11th or 12th century, but this could fit in part even in the 21st, is that things were much more fragmented always. That there wasn't, especially in Western Europe, a universal empire, right? Or at least, even if there was, it didn't factually control the world system, nor even the majority of it. The same goes for the papacy, that was rising fast and also with different means than, in fact, secular power, and so achieving this dramatic authoritative importance that had always had ever since the Roman Empire in Western Europe, and reinforcing it in a way that was starting properly also to manage, right, exploiting exactly this fragmentation to make leverage on all these divisions, and how the mechanism was essentially trying to fix in a ever more stable and solid institutions. And this, in my opinion, we've seen it. We're talking about the struggle for investitures, was probably one of the single most impacting civilizational boosters in the entire history of mankind, right? What emerged from the investiture controversy in terms of political, juridical, even military or artistical, philological, in fact, literary, cultural, broad point of view was immense. Was in the High Middle Ages the single most important thing that objectively happened from that point of view. Probably, in fact, more if you consider the qualitative results, right, the concrete ones, than this same broader spiritual movement that still was, as we've seen, very diverse, scattered, kind of incoherent in ways that were great forces moving, but these phenomena were able to catalyze them in a positive direction, right? And the results are, kind of obvious to see, right? That there was, for example, a dramatic statal and bureaucratic development already in the Middle Ages that had much to do with the development of the papal curia and its allies, and the way money was managed and what this was used for. And so there is no need also to digress on the actual positive and constructive and successful achievements of the Roman Church in the Middle Ages, properly for the development of the whole Europe, also in a secular sense. That's yet another aspect that I realize in popular culture we're not used to hear much. It's simply not been a big thing for many reasons, but it's not the usual idea because there are atheists out there. It's probably not a narrative that belongs to the main historiographical, at least to the most successful historiographical branches that at least impacted popular culture and understanding of such problems outside of academia. So I know it can sound disorienting, but it's, believe me, right from the within, I can assure you that in mediavistics in the West, nobody can make such bold statements just on the basis of some kind of anti-clerical or anachronistically progressistic way, right? Nobody reasons like that at this point. But let's say that what the papacy had turned into after having managed to free itself from a great deal of secular interference was indeed a monarchic system, right? And so many from the discontents of the reform came closer to heterodox religious movements, among which there was one that it was particularly strong at the time, in fact, the Cathar one, right? So yes, there were, let's say, conceptually separated movements, right, in part independent from one another, but still there was some degree of overlapping. Also, we can't document them with extreme precision, given that they're still, measuring moral forces is very complicated. The Albigensian Crusade objectively literally destroyed much of what Catharism had been, even from a documentary point of view. We kind of understand broadly what it is, clearly enough, for us not to be fooled in the idea that this was like an invention, right? It was a very serious thing, and just the fact that they spent, the money and the effort to carry out that crusade is quite meaningful, right? And should just by itself should be considered quite carefully. The question, though, still remains: is what is Catharism in the first place, right? A great historian of the 20th century, Volpe, said that while Pataria had been a religious movement, Catharism had indeed been a real heretical sect, right? The Cathars preached things that were apparently similar to the ones of the Patarian propaganda at the time of the church reform, which also, together with the consonants of the two terms, you see Cathar, Pater, more or less, also heretical in some ways. The same terms would be somewhat confused in public opinion at the time and basically acquired the same meaning, right? You would say, well, talking about public opinion in the Middle Ages isn't a bit too much. Well, if you're habituated to modernistic interpretation of history, like saying public opinion was born just in the 18th century because people started reading journals and so on. No. But yes, public opinion existed in the Middle Ages too, and we never have to underestimate in these movements, especially the oral dimension, that by definition is lost, right? Unless somebody kind of translated things, but put them, wrote them down. But that's how most of political and social interaction actually work, right, for a very long time. And this is, in a sense, still kind of our, okay, in our time, maybe not so much because the media are all recorded, but let's say not even everything that the media say, of course, are reflective of what, the average person would even terminologically address issues like. So you can imagine in the 12th century what scale this problem for us historians to reconstruct is taking place. So and in reality, however, the Cathars, which is a term that comes probably from the Greek katharos, which means pure, right, insisted on the necessity for the church to be poor, first of all because wealth was something material. The Cathars were practically obsessed by this, and we'll see why, because they basically backed these claims through some, gospel passages in which Jesus underlines an irreducible opposition between his kingdom and this world, reached this conclusion that essentially there would be a similar irreducible opposition between spirit and matter, light and darkness, good and evil, right? And you already understand that there is a deep problem with that, not just because of all the, if you know history of religions, you know how even properly Christianity emanated from a cultural background, from a quite heretical current, to say the least, of Judaism that was heavily influenced by other cults, right? That other religions that were essentially dualistic in nature. Persian influence was very strong for that matter, and so on, but they never quite buy into that, right? Even in the most, exoteric, aspects such as in John's Gospel, that the hymn to the Logos is quite meaningful in that sense. There's never quite a dualistic, a perfectly, dichotomic orientation at all. On the contrary, that is factually the mistake that fundamentally Cathars committed, as the Gnostics did, etc. And with, as we will see now, developing on the things in ways that are highly debatable in the first place, even just from an objective point of view. Even if you wanted to identify in the Christian double thread kind of idea of that there should be a negotiation within the two aspects as somewhat as an opposition, not as an elevation, as a constructive, positive development, which actually tends towards the idea of order and the obvious absolute prevalence of light, good, and spirit over, a world that is it's not its opposition, but its absence, its denial. This is the world meaning in a sense. Hell is not quite a real place. That eventually, we talked just recently of also how the connections with many actually pagan religions was in that regard was at some point, for cultural reasons, the need to integrate the metaphorically the idea of an underworld where the weaker creatures dwelled and were somewhat fatalistic and oblivious and chaotic and anarchic, and the light, the pure action, the moral superiority stood. But that's quite figurative in many ways, right? The Cathars had taken this quite concretely, materially, in fact, as many other movements that they were probably and historically connected to, because Catharism was not, in fact, original in, if not, in the characters that it took in the times and places that were contingent to the spread, but this was in fact a dualistic heresy that believed that the creation came to be a sort of enormous trick, right, in which Satan the powers of whom were enlarged up to make it become a sort of an anti-god, right? So it's kind of an alter theos, quite meaningful, which is in fact the great mistake there, had fundamentally trapped the spirit of man that instead was wishing to come back to the light, to the all, right? In other words, and this went together with pretty serious ideas such as that actually the God of the Old Testament was Satan himself, right? And that Christ had come essentially to liberate the world from this, and so denying all a set of, irrenounceable aspect of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which at that point Christianity had, firmly and irreversibly and unavoidably anchored itself to. And so basically declaring that it was another God, right? So it's not a monotheism, it's something else, right? There is a God, a good God and a bad God. And basically the bad God can, equates at least in power the good God. Whereas, which can, again, as we were saying before, humans are used to reason in dichotomy unavoidably, but reality is not dichotomic, right? And Christianity helps to show also the impossibility of a comprehension that goes beyond, let's say, the continuous effort to improve, and just makes you see, rather it makes you focus on just a force of evil that is somewhat an agent in itself. But it's mostly your shortcoming that people don't want to face, that the lack of a God practically means, right? And this is evident in mass society, where people were promised essentially an elevation to things that they had no discipline to attain, or never achieved quite on average, and that therefore feel kind of betrayed by the same God promise in itself that never was eliminated, nor it's eliminable from mankind, and especially that it's dramatically intense in a cultural sense, given the speed through which this mechanism has happened. But aside from that, historically, so the Cathars presented, as in many other contexts in history of religions, with some quite disturbing psychological manifestations that literally brought to the death of people, essentially to their self-killing. So basically everything that pertained to matter was created by the bad God. So matter became fundamentally the denial of the sacred as a satanic creation. So everything material had to be mortified. That's the reason why, the Bogomils, who were probably connected to the Cathars in the Balkans, had denied incarnation, the same symbol of the cross, right? And believe me, it takes a lot to trigger a Byzantine crusade. That is basically the only crusade the Byzantines ever did to eradicate these fanatics. By the way, in that were dwelling in some realities that were also quite interesting in a kind of a resistant sense against the empire in the Balkan hinterland and so on. But that's another thing. Let's not stress too much the Balkan connection, but surely was there, at least as a further, ideological, factor of development of this and reconnection with older movements of Catharism itself. Banally, because of matter, the sexual act became a most terrible sin. Not much in itself, that is, as physical interaction, but because it was fundamentally connected to procreation, because in this Cathar worldview, generating another being would have essentially brought to dooming yet another spirit to be trapped in matter, and in this condition of suffering and of irreparable tragedy that life would be, basically, in this sense. And you understand what the ultimate outcome of this really was, right? And this is basically a denial of life. And the first parallelism that comes into my mind, in our times, is partly also this, right? The denial of, the necessity even of procreating in our world. That does seemingly happen for other reasons. They tell you, not because we're too many in the globe, which is bullshit, because, in the 21st century we will peak, then we will start going down again. And that has, by the way, that reveals just a dramatic ignorance, if anything, because, yes, people think of absolute global perspectives, but they do not understand that there are quite contingental, statal ones, for example, national ones, that for which, you don't leave like a cat, or thinking that matter doesn't even count, basically, and it's just about the ideal, right? If you don't make enough children, labor force collapses, your country sinks, other countries can pressure, take it over, and so on. And this is a huge issue, right? And yes, it's almost taken in so many very young people, a radical fanatic turn, right? That is equated. It's not just something randomly spread in itself. It goes surprisingly in parallel with this kind of attitude that we'll see has many connections with what Catharism and other Manichaean Gnostic fringes fundamentally had all throughout history. Another thing that will make you consider this, in fact, that Cathars were factually vegans, and I'm not kidding. At least, who were the Cathars? That is to be determined. How many people bought into this, right? But what we know from the Cathar doctrine is that equally was they forbade essentially to eat any kind of fruit of generation. So, let's say warm-blooded animals, eggs, milks, and its derivatives. As in this sense, what was the objective was prohibited to cooperate in any way to the design of Satan against the good and the spirit. So anything that was generating or making suffer in the first place, so this was also a rejection of suffering, right? It was properly the idea that suffering is not maybe just a condition we found ourselves in that helps us, we know this evolutionarily, biological, genetically improving, right, and make us achieve more and becoming better selves and actually improving our living conditions, the same living conditions that allowed most of these people in some of the most developed areas of Europe at the time, like southern France, in fact, northern Italy, even certain areas of northeastern France or the Rhineland, were coming up with. The disease of abundance. You could have a socio-economical explanation in part for that, as a factor that just like at the time, during the 12th century, these ideas began to spread not in the countryside, but in the urban centers, that is to say, the richest places on earth at the time. In Western Europe, where there had been a tumultuous growth, where merchants were becoming to capitalize dramatically, to acquire an amount of wealth that the subsistence, economy that on average everybody was habituated from centuries, brought to such new riches that there was probably not a cultural explanation yet on how to invest them profitably, right? And that would make people feel guilty, or at least, okay, we made the money, then what do we do now? We have no purpose anymore. The lack of purpose, the same thing that we're witnessing today after the masses brutally enriched all over the West, and all these ideologies coming back, to this kind of radical moral subjectivism and the radical demonization of the hierarchical political and social order, and this abstract and aggressive condemnation of capitalism, of wealth, of material in fact, quality improvement, life of quality improvement, of which the same people benefit from, and that yet realize that do not have enough, essentially, moral capacity to cope with, to be properly responsibilized for, that is, to take also, to make the effort to partake to this greater stage of civilizational development in an effective way, would bring to a sort of denial, of a cognitive dissonance, of a desperate need to evade reality, to evade even your own body, right? As we will see, the ultimate end here was death, right? The greatest victory of good over evil for the Cathars was death. Is the idea that, of course, the spirit freed itself from matter. So the Cathar follower reached perfection when he let him herself starve to death. It was called the Endura at the time. So does this idea, also the radical separation of spirit and matter, reminds you something like gender theory? There's other things that are, even properly the denial of our biological reality, is to say that spirit and matter are one thing, fundamentally. They are so deeply intertwined that it doesn't make any human sense to consider the two things separated otherwise. That this is our condition, that's what we have to go with, and that fundamentally denying that is just a form of cowardice. Doesn't matter how extreme certain conditions can appear. This is no coincidence. This happened every single time in the history of civilization. Such broader lack of purpose connected to a fortunate improving of the living conditions has struck cultures, societies, very often bringing to their decline, because all the moral dimension was fundamentally atrophied and brought to nothing, because these elements began to lack the connection between their individual role and the rest of the system, that indeed by 12th century Europe was becoming witnessing a great leap forward. So an enormous explosion of forces, moral, material ones, that in a very troubled world that had yet to be regulated again. This is yet another issue, right? That before that time, the system was relatively simple, and so it was easier to conceive it. Just like today, the world has boomed, literally, from an economical, demographical point of view. It's ever more complex. So we're disoriented and we lack the sense of purpose. We think that, in fact, we don't understand what's going on anymore. And this is a psychological consequence of it at the same time, right? And it always existed historically. Think about all the great, this idea, the great successes of civilization come after a great struggle, moments of privation where still people had a purpose, had felt the meaning, and were straight disciplined in line, carrying that out, arriving to wealth, to well-being. Finally, they collapse morally. This happened all the freaking time, and it took very also, as a consequence, very radical. The form of very radical ideologies that were always struggling against the hierarchy, which in part, as to salvage some of these aspects, of course, as we were saying before, fringe is needed, extremism is needed to make orthodoxy, regulating itself in a way that can be sustainable by the whole system. So it's important too for this system to exist. The problem is that there is, this is still based on individual responsibility. The system doesn't quite work by itself, by some magic force. It's still how people act. So what we don't see about the progress of civilization is that this takes casualties, that this takes an enormous amount of friction, that things are very often inefficient, dysfunctional, right? But that's still that, putting patch after patch, we do progress, right, in that, along that path. And so even if Catharism was treated as a Christian heresy, and doesn't matter how much it considered Christ like an aeon, that is, an emanation of the God of light, it was rather, another religion of dualistic kind, or at least of a Christianism heavily influenced by Gnosticism and of Manichaeism, right? And this was quite evident for what we were saying before about the Cathar mythology, where the God creator of the Old Testament was the evil god Satan, right? And it's likely that forms of Manichaeism had reached Europe by the early 12th century through the Byzantine Empire, the Balkans, or maybe through the pilgrims that came back from the Holy Land. Right? In fact, very often it's, propagandists were known as the Bulgars in Western Europe. So naturally, the Cathar propaganda would have not been effective if it had not been proposed in those forms of popular Christianity, that the most developed instrument of which, especially in those times of disappointment for the Reform that had founded within the church the altar power of the clergy, was the denunciation of the mundanity of ecclesiastical hierarchies. Right, and that's quite easy to get. Right, it's a form of you make leverage of social envy on the possibility of seizing that, of taking that out. Right, after all, Europe was growing, as we see, ever more populated. The elites were coping now with ever greater movements, and so the fact that they were quite wealthy, was designing them as targets also of some properly revolts that happened very often in the 12th century, aimed at killing the bishops, seizing their treasures, and so on. So properly, even in there, it wasn't much like in all these broader movements. Sometimes we, of course, we see them as a sort of force of modernization or something, but as I was saying before, is mostly putting patches and over quite horrifying things, such as the fact that, of course, most revolutions were, if not all revolutions, were in a way just designed to take power, for instance, say in a political intelligence sense, from mostly the side of the revolutionary elites that were almost the middle classes, that were naturally the most, at that point, kind of, wanted to break through because they had starting to have the moral and material forces to enter, at least to be co-opted by the otherwise closed aristocracy. But as far as the masses were concerned, it was essentially about stealing, killing, like letting loose the chaotic, chthonic forces of the masses that basically have no value but pure abjection and and nothing else fundamentally. And of course that were coming out of all these processes defeated, because of all these revolutions fundamentally brought was that the lowest were effectively, at the end of the story, always be, suppressed, especially the violent fringes, and or however framed in a much better structured and imposing and heavier power that had ever been seen before, right? And this is evident even if you consider, in fact, what happened with the Albigensian Crusade in the 13th century. In many ways sanctioned the superiority of the feudal elites, their the subjugation, even in that case of Occitania to northern France, and so definitely not a victory of those elements that had hoped for, like, at that point, not even maybe much, because again, it was provided with a bit more of understanding that needs to to be part of civilization for the way it is, maybe integrating it, improving it in some ways. Most other forces simply cannot see themselves. They don't have the tools to make that work of civilization. I mean, what could peasants really conceive about the political order or theology, or what that this whole system had to be about? That's the same reason why eventually the peasantry was crushed by in the 14th century, where all the proletarians, the textile workers in the Italian and Flemish cities rebelled as much as the French peasantry en masse, but were at the end of the day all repressed. And the Ancien regime, as we know it, lasted for half of a millennium of actual oppression. Yes, but also come from the fact that these masses had not been capable, of course, of considering themselves in a unitary way or in a concerted effort, or even having the means to consider them like that. So that's why, I don't know, socialism, communism eventually also made leverage on this, when also the spread of literacy helped, at least to spread this knowledge, this awareness more easily in the masses and making leverage on them. But just because they had acquired an actual power in the vast of labor force, of the process of industrialization. But in the most civilized areas of the world, of course, communism never took over, because of course it's a weaker force. It makes leverage on the fourth state, so the most morally and materially abject elements of a community. So you can't build a civilization on that base. It's going to be a disaster proof, Soviet Russia, Maoist China, etc. And this aspect is really important, because you understand that there is a parallelism that you can easily trace when you encounter this ideology. You say, well, why did the Cathars happen? Right? This is it's a complex answer, as you understand. I need to take, this video is brutally concise regarding the whole thing that we know, but still, it's not just a random, you see, I presume most people see today Cathars in a sort of heroic, the free thinkers that were oppressed by the terrible obscurantism of the establishment and all these things. This is Enlightenment mythology, and also, if not anti-clerical one, very often kind of Marxist background. It has nothing to do with any kind of historical reality that we teach all over Western academies. It's literally, that's a joke. That it has nothing to do with any kind of evidence or interpretation of history that we do on a scientific base. But again, for many people, it's much easier to do this. And what I find fascinating, and you wonder why I also indulge in all this kind of, criticism of the, beliefs and so on, it's because there is a historical reason that we have to understand why people believe this today, right? And it's not mere historical ignorance. At least that comes with lots of other things. So how did Cathar, and aside from that, I would like to stress that today we don't talk about that, because as I promised, we talk just about Catharism as an ideology. But this movement wasn't at all just the one of the poor, right? It made leverage on the masses, as we've seen, because there were starting to be like a great amount of masses that had more political and social power than before, because as we've seen, the fast enrichment of the of these regions in Europe, the most urbanized ones, so the ones also where some kind of industry happened, so where economy was much more intertwined and dependent, of course, on this labor force, and therefore looked at the most evident and jarring contrast between the really rich, the elites, or at least the new ones that were fastly rising, and this the devastating misery that you can imagine, being, however, pretty much the standard by the 12th century, by our own perspective. That was making people wondering, but why this should be, and what kind of situations, what kind of moves should we take? And again, what is fascinating is that just like today, all these new radical ideologies are, let's say, meeting with favor by a great part of the masses, just as at the time. But first of all, these masses do not actually understand them. And those who are actually pioneering these things in a doctrinal, radical sense are actually the elites, right? Part of the elites that feel at that point confused, feel kind of purposeless, or are grown in kind of an excess or lack of discipline. Or yes, the idea is let's feast because finally we are rich, and then yes, we don't care about how our children are going to be grown because finally we're rich, we can do whatever we want. And so that relaxation of the idea of authority, of order, discipline does bring to this kind of complete lack of purpose and incapacity to distinguish even, and to actually accept that the problem is not much of a broader one, but it's a problem that originates within you, for which you're fully responsible. So this idea of escaping from the world, denying it, right, just like Cathar did, and pretending that it's rigged, hopelessly rigged by evil. Does it remember anything to you in the current political discourse, right? Is of course a rejection of reality. It's paranoia. It's exactly what it's not just a mental disorder, but fundamentally it stems from a negative reaction to reality, not a positive one. Because even if you think that there is something wrong with society, you don't tear it down just for because you personally fail in coping with it. It's an incredibly narcissistic and selfish idea, right? And this passes also through kind of the imposition of that to others. So of course the masses have kind of they like the idea that they can overthrow those rich elites that look so evil and corrupted and whatever, that are actually the ones that were at that time organizing the world in a pretty intense way. If you look what the feudal monarchies or the papal curia were carrying out in terms again of political theory, of legal studies, of administration, and they were building states, right? What these masses were doing were actually trying to find a place in this, but given the complexity of the system, sometimes remaining cut out, and so breaking out violently for reasons, in fact, that didn't even have to have with these ideologies at all, but that these ideologies were quite eager to attract from their side by saying that they had been betrayed by this terrible order of terribly evil people. Because at the end of the day, the reflection of the fact that the church was so wealthy and powerful was that the more materially identifiable it was, and the more satanic it was in nature. So it's basically you attribute the greatest evil, essentially an anti-human one, to civilization, which is exactly what is happening today at the same time. And for the same reason. And fortunately enough, yes, this was a moment of crisis, as in the 12th century, heresies risked to take over Europe. It's not an overstatement, right? You can argue that the fact that it didn't happen, and that, of course, not just the establishment managed to maintain control and to increase power and, to develop also, an harmonic form of political and social organization compared to this tumultuous phase in a more subtle direction, but also the fact that it eventually took on a scientific and rational orientation compared to the mystical and kind of ascetic one that had been proper of these phases, right? In the 13th century, they shifted to scholastics, so they passed from Neoplatonism, that in fact is, if you know Plotinus, etc., what they thought Plato was at the time, in fact, is an emanatistic idea, which is the same one the Cathars were thinking of how essentially Christ even was in terms of the God of light, etc. In terms of instead in a objective, logical, rational, confident view of the world, based in fact on scientific evidence and backed by a mirroring moral system that is mostly also very close to what has remained in this orthodox sense at the base of the West, that we know in fact came at the end, fortunately, of the main heretical movements during the Middle Ages, by the 13th century. Even though Catharism, surgically wouldn't be eradicated up to the mid-14th, which is kind of interesting, by the way, because it means that made a good job, because that was exactly the moment of a further, spread of mass, rebellions and so on. But that was mostly happening for reasons that weren't so ideologically mediated. That literally was a massive economical, demographic crisis. Whereas in contraction, whereas in the 12th century, Europe was actually booming. So that's also why you gotta be very careful about this, right? It's not anecdotal to stress that certain radical ideologies emerged. Think about the 60s, the 70s, at the moment of when we finally achieved a mass wealth worth of this name in the history of civilization. And these are ideas that are fundamentally iconoclastic. They're disruptive. They are anti-civilizational, anti-traditional. And again, it's not because there was, that there wasn't something, to fix about that world. This was a brutal world, right? There was a lot of hypocrisy. These people wanted answers. There was somebody that was legitimately concerned about, why did the church, after all, take a direction that seemed to be, so opposite to the idea of, the Gospels that, do not stress, the need of such wealth. It was obstinated, right? It wasn't just having a lot of wealth and living poorly and having that wealth just for administering the church. It was just also something else. It was about, the clergy being very, very powerful, also in, being quite luxurious in lifestyle and so on. So, as always, civilization is not perfect, but still it's a bloody miracle that it exists in the first place, and you should evaluate that, yes, that there may be something to fix in that, but the whole system, arriving to say that the whole reality is rigged by evil, so that you have to escape even existence and die, preferably, through the Endura as a solution for humanity, well, it doesn't quite sound like a way to solve people's suffering and pathos and issues and problems, broadly speaking. These are the typically chthonic forces that reemerged, at times where, the popular masses reemerge with an important degree and, do not know how to cope with a new situation otherwise, because, again, they lack the tools. And the elites have to cope with that. And disciplining them and educating them and showing them what's the way so that they can cooperate for the collective benefit, as fundamentally it happened historically. Like if you see history just as a continuous oppression of the people by the terrible evil elite, you cannot explain the radical quality of life improvement in the world. Of the average person, not of the elite. That is, at the end of the day, most likely an elite because they accomplished something that made them kind of deserve to be an elite, while the average person maybe really didn't, right? So think of this as well. And there is no doubt that many people adhered to the Cathar sect exactly with the will to become better Christians. Again, we don't know to which extent you can actually name a Cathar in a sense. We know though that we know first of all something of their organization in a strictly sectary sense, where there were two orders. The first ones were the simple sympathizers, right? They were not called to respect every norm of abstinence, nor to, let's say, that they knew actually entirely the whole mythical religious Cathar system. So they were kept out, right? There was something, in fact, properly gnostic in this idea. There was somebody that was, better, hopelessly better than the other, because, they denied, they denied an improvement of everybody, because somebody was somewhat hopelessly doomed, and just by being elected to that specific knowledge, you could be saved, and all the others were kind of doomed, right? And so the others could kind of contribute, but not so much. And so these sympathizers were mostly so-called the believers, right? When they reached the full, awareness of the situation, was an initiatic ceremony known consolamentum that tells pretty much of the kind of the pathetic, if not properly pathological, idea of this. You had to be properly consolated of this terrible human condition that make them accept to the superior order, and these became the perfects, right? I believe that a doctrine that wants to stress the difficulty of of how to the corruption in the world, etc., and the problems of it, and does not acknowledge its complexity, etc. It has the guts to call somebody the perfect is quite quite hypocritical, if not properly narcissistic delusion. And the fact that this was an hypocritical and fundamentally frustrated system is mirrored also by the fact that the Cathars, very far from being just some itinerant preachers, that also provided for the model, as of the mendicant orders later on, because were actually a response of the Roman Church that partly integrated lots of these movements that didn't take such radical stands, but that were to be controlled, had to be mediated. Let's hear what you have to say. Like the papacy was open at that point, and integrated so much. A lot of Franciscanism was quite borderline orthodox, if not factually heterodox, and in some pinches surely heretical. But the church said, okay, your instances are welcome, right? And you have to, of course, to maintain certain standards of orthodoxy, otherwise we cannot really endorse you. But if you are able to catalyze this broader mass questioning and issues and instances, etc., we will allow you to preach. We will allow you to have a dialogue in our world, right? Things took a much more dangerous direction when you also locate politically, in a bit of an international context, the phenomenon of Catharism per se. Now, there were many movements in Europe at this time. The Patarians, as we've seen, the St. Cathars, the Valdensians, and so on. And it's not that they liked each other particularly. The Valdensians were, when Rome launched the crusade in southern France, saying, okay, green light, we're perfectly fine with that. Exterminate those motherfuckers because, that they are just pure heretics. And the reason why it was happening that is that not only, again, the Cathars were this kind of sect, or, dispersed free thinkers in a free world. Not at all. There is no such thing like free world nor freedom of thought at that point. And Cathars didn't make an exception. You would imagine this medieval heretics, again, as, some Protestant or enlightening historiography wanted to fool you about, in the modern age, to make the Roman Catholic Church see as the evil embodied. But the reality is quite different. All these heretics were equally intolerant, fanatic, and oppressive as, let's say, the church could be at the time. This is also kind of common knowledge for anybody who has read any kind of historiography, the updated one existing on the topic. But it's not even it shouldn't even be a surprising thing. What do you think that a 12th century person reasoned like? That's why it's a miracle that things actually improved towards a more developed direction, a more civil, more rational and scientific-based one from this standpoint. And this is the beauty of humanity. What, the Cathars were kind of denying that sense. But what actually happened is that the Cathars not only created their own church, but they were backed, of course, and that's why the Albigensian Crusade happened, by secular authorities. And the Cathars created a parallel church that was completely identical in hierarchy, in structures, in repressive means, including the Inquisition, to the Roman Catholic one. So if you ever thought of them to be some kind of heroes of free thinking or whatever, just know that these people persecuted and killed and burned at the stake just like the others, right? And not maybe for the reasons that, after all, might have been also kind of acceptable by, the civilizational needs of the time. Secular justice wasn't any better, right? The Inquisition, as we were saying before, actually pioneered some of the fundamental rights that still exist in modern tribunals, including, guaranteeing, for example, the necessity of an evidence for condemning somebody, which secular tribunals up to the end of the Middle Ages didn't quite conform to, on average, still. So the main reason why you would argue eventually these the Cathar movement specifically became so threatening and dangerous up to the point of organizing a freaking crusade, which basically, yes, there were some wars in medieval times that were labeled as crusades because maybe, let's say, a ruler was excommunicated, but factually at that point was just making the rebels that already existed against him, fighting against him with some kind of papal endorsement, but still to the end of some kind of pacification, and for international reasons that, as we've seen historically, were often kind of sensible. I don't know, go look there are very interesting videos on the Hohenstaufen period that, as you know, had a pretty strained relations with the papacy. And there, especially if you like the empire and, kind of this secular idea, you're angry towards the papacy, but also there are instances that show how, think about Otto of Brunswick, that there wasn't often kind of a evidently moral behavior, for example, in this attempt to breaking basically any international rule, first swearing something, then breaking the oath, and this was done also on the Bible, and so on some kind of moral standards that, after all, were what, as we've seen, had contributed to a kind of stability. The main reason, of course, was that Occitania, and especially the county of Toulouse, and so all these very developed, very rich, but still somewhat politically fragmented, and therefore not very unitarily acting areas of southern Gaul, were trying to escape the push, the expansionistic push of the axis that was being formed between Paris and Rome. France emerging by the early 13th century as the leading power in Europe, and being in this allied with the papacy, a relation that had gone on for many centuries since the conversion. I mean, since the relations between the Roman and the Gallic Church, but also since the conversion of the Merovingians. The St. Carolingian Empire is a product of this axis, and so with this general wealth system that was taking shape at that point in Europe, and that was seeing, of course, the French, so the northern Gallic rulers, the Capetians, that technically were nominally kings of France, that included, in this sense, territorial, also the whole land comprehended between the Pyrenees and the Alps on the Mediterranean. We're trying to recover these lands that belonged to these in political legacy to the northern rulers that instead had remained autonomous mostly throughout the centuries, and that had in fact developed and always owned since ancient times kind of another identity compared to the north. South of the Loire was mostly a kind of a almost Visigothic legacy as opposed to the Frankish one. It was a different language. It was a different society. As we were saying before, part of the reason why Catharism was so successful there is because of the important urbanization and more evenly distribution of wealth. In at least compared to northern France, was much more militarized and autocratic and hierarchized in nature. And Catharism was used fundamentally to to back the autonomistic policy of the Occitanian principalities, that in this sense also asked for support to Catalonia, the Kingdom of Aragon, right? That were trying essentially to escape the northern domination, and everything was quite ambiguous because even if you know the essentials of the Albigensian Crusade, you know that there was an effort, it was a relentless effort from the side of the papacy to conclude the matter in peaceful ways. Right, there was a request from the side of the papal administration to persecute the Cathars, to say, you know, these are not going by the book. They're basically delirating. They're inventing there is two gods in the universe. One is evil, there is, you know, another is is good, and you know you have to escape reality up to death, and you know not making children. You know, this is complete lunacy. And of course demonizing the church and the papacy, albeit creating exactly the same hierarchy with the same wealth problems, and creating in fact cases of literally schizophrenia, and they're documented at the time. This idea of starving to death, right, it doesn't come from normal people, mentally speaking, and so we have to be quite serious, because it's, again, so many health problems are spreading still today, and it's not by addressing them as normality that we're actually helping anybody in this process. We need to go back to reason, and to order, and to self-control, to individual responsibility. As you know, the papal legate eventually was assassinated. The Count of Toulouse wouldn't comply to this, you know, papal pressure. So at that point, after many efforts to prevent a crusade, which wasn't really an interest of the papacy normally, right? That this said, okay, you wanted this, and the thing happened. You know, France participated. It was also a very good opportunity for the Capetian monarchy actually to get rid of the French nobility. That the secular nobility was, you know, just, you know, quite competitive towards the monarchy. They said, okay, we give you full freedom of action in the south. Indeed, the Crusaders committed enormous atrocities, but even in there, what kind of atrocities were there? There is, if I'm not wrong, it was the siege of Béziers that remained kind of famous because of the phrase of the papal legate that was besieging the city, and said, you know, at some point, you know, when the city fell, they had to exterminate basically the city because it had resisted, and somebody told him, but there are Catholics within there next to the Cathars, and the bishop said, the God will recognize their own. This phrase has been is one of the single most twisted and manipulated, ideologically manipulated, probably in the entire history of entire history, especially for the Middle Ages, and very often, if not inescapably, in a radically anti-clerical sense. Just like saying, you know, ignoring all the political military rules of engagement, let's say, of the time, and still in part of today. That is to say, independently from the reasons of the crusade, that of course was a war like any other, they had besieged, the Crusaders had besieged the city, and initially, as it was actually normal to do, they would say, you know, we're fighting against the Cathars, right? They were entrenching themselves there, and they knew there were Catholics among them, and everybody at the time knew that killing was a sinful thing, but also that we cannot really escape it in a world where there is order and justice and authority, and for people to live prosperly and orderly. And so they said to the Catholics, at least, that weren't surely people that in fact, as facts proved, liked very much that crusade and the reasons of it, said, you know, come out and you will survive. You will be spared. Nothing will happen to you. This is what's done in many instances historically, even of ferocious hatred. When, you know, a city was besieged, you know, the besiegers said, you know, we're going to kill you all if you resist. So if you want to survive, come out now. It was an important strategic measure, naturally, because the more fighting force was inside, the more difficult it was for the besiegers, but it's also still kind of a, you know, reasonable negotiation, and those people would have actually been spared. But no, the Catholics inside, at least a good part of them, kept remaining fighting, resisting. So at that point, using weapons against the Crusaders as much as the Crusaders were using against them. And so essentially, if you resist, it means you are a hostile force, right? You can debate on the necessity of extermination. Now, I don't know the details of that. I don't think we really know, but it's a bit like the Christian sack of Jerusalem in 1099. That is to say, yes, they killed not just the Muslims that had resisted, but all the Jews and even the Christians that inhabited Jerusalem. And guess why? Because, it was normal to, in any kind of circumstance, aside from any crusade, and by the way, every war at the time, every single one of every single people was fought in the name of God. The Crusades are not special because of that, and that's another, modernistic, historical, illiterate myth that unfortunately we've been fed, in a disgusting fashion. And if you resist, then I kill you because you're trying to kill me, and as a sort of punishment, especially if I win, I can do whatever I want. In that sense, but still there are some rules, and these rules include the fact that if you resisted to me, I'm going to kill you afterwards. And the idea at that point was that it's not that they would have preferred to kill more or less people, it's just that they would have done it anyway. It was done in many other contexts, and not only, even when it wasn't done, because of course somebody was spared. These are bloody events, right? I'm not saying that they were, okay, it's what normal to kill people. No, it wasn't really. But the fact even in there that a civilization at the time was able not just to document these massacres, but to also raise questions about their necessity, and this kind of, let's say, of issues, morally speaking, actually speaks of the same morality of that civilization. Because another would simply say, either rejoice of the blood of the extermination, as primitive peoples usually did all the time, boasting how many people they had killed and skinned and enslaved or whatever. Another thing is, by the 11th, the 12th century saying, the 13th century saying, okay, we did this, it was ferocious, but it's kind of a part of a broader comprehensive things for which we're not at all happy to kill, and we document this thing exactly to see how atrocious it was, but there are problems with this, and we should be ever more, cautious and thoughtful in the way we do. And also, these were the centuries of spreading, in fact, of all the first theories about properly how war had to be led in a way that wasn't just, kind of comparative, like I did this, and so you can't do that. But in a broader, kind of also more modern direction. So in any case, it wasn't the gratuitous butchery of, indiscriminated butchery of people just based on religion. It was an actual war where somebody resisted in arms, and therefore at that point basically refused lost any right to have any consideration for its own life, at least during combat. And later on, however, also for the repression, that surely is debatable. But again, it's not the evil crusaders doing something terribly bad because they were crusaders and because they were sent by the papacy, and these were pure angels that hadn't done anything. Right, there were massacres operated by same Cathars, and they could be capable of doing the same thing in the same way. And before that, right, including the repression, the persecution of religious dissent, and all that stuff. So, again, there is no way the Cathars can be morally elevated from not just the standards of the time, but also of their butchers fundamentally. And what is interesting in this regard is that they weren't the only ones that made that end cross-culturally. Like in the Byzantine Empire against the Bogomils, it happened the same. Even in Islam, certain radical, especially extremistic Shia fringes were kind of very similar in nature, very dualistic, Gnostic, etc., which were ended in the same way. I mean, there is something universal in there that you have to kind of realize. It's a bit like modern terrorism, right? And the problem is when this modern terrorism takes on some kind of real political territorial form, which starts becoming kind of, serious. And that's why, states like, I don't know, North Korea, or they become parias because they're objectively morally inferior to others, and there is no way around that, and that's also a principle of civilization. Regarding the Cathars, the situation was much more mixed, though, right? They weren't surely a totalitarian regime or anything. I'm not drawing that comparison. I'm simply, in fact, this is what historiography today tells it, that of course the papacy kind of had to justify in part this thing, because it turned into, you can imagine, with the lack of coercive means of the time, into this essentially French-driven ambition to take over the South, a dramatic, mess that, in a sense, the papacy in itself couldn't quite even directly control. That basically the crusade, I mean, the Cathar movement was repressed in largely in that phase, but also the control of the region from the French, because it wouldn't happen up to the next, in some decade, right? So the Occitania was exhausted by that, so it didn't even have the strength to carry on the struggle in many ways. That's why the thing declined, but it was a very difficult situation. And it didn't end immediately. And so who was a Cathar? Like, it's not that you have a past that says, I'm a Cathar. Many of these people were actually not convinced, but actually good Catholics. That is to say, some Cathars, yes, were probably the event of Béziers shows that there were Catholics and Cathars fighting together against Crusaders at some level, in some ways, because that was their city and they had their own interest and so on. So it was kind of obvious. So there was no easily identifiable boundary sometimes between who was, even in the institutions that they populate, like who was Cathar, who was not, and how far did that go. And especially there was a great variety of movements, right? In this sense, Occitania wasn't like a unitary state for which, there was an established Cathar orthodoxy, and so that could be enforced uniformly. No, it was like a broader tendency that surely flourished in those places, that is very well documented, even properly by the effort even of the church later on to create mendicant orders the Dominicans were expressly created as an educated order to counter the Cathars. Were often also educated people in that regard, and made some interesting theological points, because they were the product of that more kind of advanced southern French civilization was flourishing like other areas of Europe at the time. And so nobody can deny that Catharism, as this force, and a strongly heterodox force at least, and in probably the most in many cases at least, was staunchly and unitly and self-declaratedly, self-declaratedly maybe not, but heretical in nature, and so quite openly at least against the Catholic Orthodox in that sense, is history. So Catharism spread far and wide because it had reached, as we've seen, Provence. Occitania actually broadly meant also Lombardy and Tuscany, right? And it was so dense to really pose a threat to the predominion of the Catholic Church, right? So it was no joke, really. And again, the means of repressions that were put in action at that point were not also merely an instrument of certain repression, right? In order, the fact that heresies stopped in that sense and were crushed and defeated is not owed to the superpower of the Roman Church, or just the force of the brutal force of the French Crusaders. This has to do with the broader reaction that even in very similar movements to Catharism, such as the Valdensians, for example, that were something else, actually, of course, but were still heterodox, and more, actually had met with a lot of antagonism. Right? Lots of people said these Cathars are just crazies. Even these heterodox movements supported the Roman Church in the repression of the Cathars. So it was a broader effort, as we've seen, that mixed political, theological, socio-economical. It was a worldview against another, let's be honest. And that eventually succeeded in favor of the establishment. I mean, of a broader establishment, not just the church as something that ruled sovereign, as an absolute power over Europe. That never existed. Even for the secular powers themselves, there was no uniform or even prevalent government in Europe. Like from one side, it was an extremely complex thing. It simply didn't exist in pre-modern times. So again, we have to see the moral forces that were counterposed and realizing that the Cathar model had discontented too many people. They were not just the elite, were not just the establishment, whatever it means, just making a modern kind of parallelism to the way we use this, but they were actually the majority of people who said these ideas are radical. There is nothing healthy in pretending that we shouldn't make children being otherwise terrible sinners, because matter is hopelessly evil, and the beauty of the world is a satanic creation, and we should essentially not eat any kind of animal product, and we should die of starvation as the greatest ambition of a good Christian, because this is literally what Catharism preached. So it's a real issue that, as you can see, we can easily relate to today. It's not a matter of saying, okay, the world works perfectly, everything is fine, there are no problems, we shouldn't fix them. It's simply having to cope with an incredibly, consistent amount of people who seem to have completely lost the plot about any kind of logical, rational, scientific, and moral ground, and that we don't really know how to cope with. Aside from, I don't say, at the time they knew how to cope with these things, apparently. Today we realize that we can't really do it in the same way, but this doesn't necessarily mean that these things are not going to cause or have already caused problems, including dead people. There is a suicide epidemics among youth, and not much of the one that we think as poor and oppressed and discriminated, but we're talking about the well-off one, right? The allegedly privileged one that buys into these ideologies that become like an autoimmune disease for them, and they lose any purpose, and they don't see what they're going with. And I don't think that it's moral to assume that we shouldn't fight in the opposite direction in order to save people's lives in this regard. Bit more of details on Cathar organization can go and about for example, the existing of different churches at a time. This is interesting relatively to that process of political fragmentation. Was kind of, at that point quite distinctive of Occitania. Here there would be a lot to say. I made a video on the county of Toulouse that talks at some point also about the problem and the fact that there was a kind of contrast between the feudal authority, was the count of Toulouse, and also the city council. And so it's within these institutional mechanisms that also the popes tried to intervene, because there wasn't like kind of a fixed authority. So actually the fact that there were itinerant churches held by bishops, let's say churches held by itinerant bishops, it's better to say, is quite meaningful, because it gives you the idea that part of the reasons we have to in documenting the Cathar churches is in fact the fact that they were somewhat heterogeneous, and that this, however, doesn't mean that they quite didn't exist, or that kind of the papacy invented the fact that Cathars even existed just because there wasn't something, kind of comparable, at least in terms of unitarity, to the Roman Church, because these churches were well organized, right? The members were also well educated. It was some important development, and as we've seen, certain organisms, certain means of control, and so on. The only sign of recognition of the perfects was the black of their clothes, right? And the incredibly pale look determined by the very scarce vegetarian diet that they assumed to survive. This is important because the Cathar perfects, let's say, managed to challenge in a contradictory sense, in a contrarian way, the Christian priests by beating them on this kind of exterior dimension, right? Say you're rich, you have, you're well fed, you have good clothes, etc. So you're not perfect because you don't suffer, because you're essentially following the satanic luxury of the world, because matter is intrinsically evil and we should all escape that. And the question at that point is, well, why don't you just die right away, if that's the ultimate form of of victory over Satan. And so these people were also educated, right, in the Bible. They had, as we've seen, their own interpretation of it. So in many ways, these people seemed more chaste and saint, especially in front of the masses, than the Roman clergy, which is interesting, because the Catholic clergy in this sense was the one that was called also to respond in the debates in front of the people. Again, we know these things happened, but of course one thing is being there, hearing what they would say, and another thing is documenting that in an accurate fashion, and it's often not easy to do. Also consider that the roots of Catharism are quite it just didn't happen overnight, right? It is true, as we were saying before, that there were these external influences probably coming from the East, where Gnostic theories had kind of always remained around, and also favored in there by the fragmentation, the political, ethnic, religious fragmentation of the Near East. Also the much more complicated Islamic the situation that kind of produced kind of way more diversions, at least in their characterization, probably in their diversification, than the same Christendom. And yet, what is important to stress here is not just a religious issue. It was, again, a political and social one. This was based on the fast changing of a world to which these people felt not to have adequate responses, at least at the point of pursuing such dangerous and dramatic endeavors, theoretically, and especially because also there was a broader realization of the importance of the expansion of the Roman Church in power, in coercive capacities, and of course these people thought to be, especially the elites, etc., of Occitania, thought to be dangerous for them. And even in this, what actually meant is that, of course, they feared to be taken over by the Capetians again, and you can argue there. Eventually, as you know, this happened, but as for many things, a system that cannot really safeguard autonomously its independence, how can, why would we think it's provided with more moral force than another to cope with other issues that still have to be faced by the greater system that manages to take over, as the France of the 13th century, as enormous power and with great development, actually managed to achieve. Right? It's not a matter of saying, the Nazis were more morally elevated than the Poles in 1939 in ideological terms, but you can argue that Germany at that point was something altogether independently from Nazism as a much more morally strong system than Poland was, and that's the reason why they took over. So these things cannot. This double level is very important to stress, because it makes you see that civilization is not just a matter of ideology, right? It's also about certain universal bases that are needed to make things work. And so ideology can be in surface some kind of outward feature, etc., but still there are some universal human mechanisms in order to make larger states work with a degree of of order, of control, of security, etc., that are effectively what the majority of the weight of a civilization actually represents. Right. This is also the history of totalitarian regimes, like in this case. But you can argue, even with communism, that in order to rule a system like Russia, at some point, famously enough, the Bolsheviks had to reduce their own extremism. They had to start reprivatizing some system. I mean, ask Trotsky was killed for was to escape and was killed for that, and eventually Stalin was obliged to do it again, because otherwise they would have not been able to rule Russia. Would have simply collapsed to the ground, and with an enormous more amount of people dead than already was the case at that point. It was already, by the way, happening. And they need to reprivatize, and so obviously to start going wired back to actual reality and not ideological fanatism and wishful thinking to make things work. So again, those things cannot be faked, and this comes also for the broader interpretation of historical phenomena. If heresies were so widespread by the 12th century and the system was able to put them down, again, this has not much to do with the idea that you have to favor, the Catholic hierarchy and its wealth and its abuse and its corruption. It has to do with the fact that beyond that, there is actually something working, and working also pretty damn well. And that's basically the reality of any kind of human community, where there are lots of things that do not work, but still, they are the ones on which we should concentrate in relative terms, because of course they are the ones we want to fix. But we also shouldn't forget that we're kind of giving for granted the fact that we even achieved such a stage that fortunately works, and we kind of benefit dramatically of. And the history of Europe at that point was actually going ever better at basically all levels, up to the crisis of the 14th century. And even at that point, medieval civilization, unlike antiquity, withstood the crisis and went on to develop further, right, with all the sacrifices and the issues that happened, but still in ways that were kind of more emergential than the ones in the 12th century, which mostly witnessed instead an hypertrophy of these kind of, in fact, properly heretical ideas, meant etymologically speaking as a different choice, that, however, weren't benefiting the whole system. As generally speaking, if there are so many people that disagree, it's not really a good sign, right? It's a good sign if the opinions of these people can be expressed, if they're expressed in a democratic context. But it's not at all positive that these people disagree by such large degree on such radical issues, because if the disagreement is so great is the mistake from in between. And so the greater a certain amount of people, the more a certain amount of people is distant from reality, and so there is something inherently wrong what they actually think reality is, and so that cannot be tolerated by certain standard. And that's why things like the repression of the Albigensians actually happened, and still in a historical context where you can't be horrified by, but that again was kind of the norm at the time, and today we're not even that distant from that, but that still is surely meaningfully different for us to appreciate still that maybe even that bloody chapter was contributed to the stability of our civilization for much better things to come there, right? And so don't mistake people in history for superheroes or martyrs or this hopeless forces of good and evil, because that is just being a Cathar, as an extremist, and not as an intelligent, scientifically rationally oriented individual. That is, turns out, the only thing that makes civilization work for the common good. So I know that to some, these videos at this point are not watched particularly much because of all the channel's dynamics and so on, but I wonder sometimes what happens when somebody that has literally never pictured the thing in these terms comes, to my chance, you cannot avoid but to hate me, in a sense. And I understand that. I understand that there is, we have arrived to the point where we have completely dishabituated people to reason in these terms, or to reason at all, or to even provide some criteria for a rational discourse. But this is the picture that emerges from such from the historical reality as we know it, and I don't think there is much of another way to interpret it. Right? I would conclude just by saying this, given that I promised I would salvage something of those ideas, is that is there a value in that dissent, right? Is there like a contribution that the Cathars brought to Western civilization? Of course, I believe so. I don't deny that, right? It's just, as I was saying before, I think the fringe, the extremism, the mistake, the error is necessary for the improvement of civilization. That dissent is you can't really reason without dissent. And in this sense, don't believe that positions there were so, in fact, radically opposed or dichotomically, in fact, disposed in a, so that we have to reason from one side the Catholic Church, from one side the Cathars. No, there was a lot in between, and there were lots of people who actually were standing in between, as always, right? That still were posing questions and still were contesting the church, and just, however, reflect that not all of these people, that were freaking many, were launched a crusade against. So, about the reason why that happened, consider that the same church later on integrated the evangelic paparistic movements, as they were called, and I made videos about this, exactly to prove that a real civilization does take strength also from these movements, as long as they, of course, don't exceed in a way that is basically a non-coming back point, right? And so if so many interests also in, based on some sort of national direction, right? What would have, you may ask what the Cathars would have achieved had they persisted. Well, simply they would have created a parallel church in southern France, and probably intermingling with other branches, especially in the northwestern Iberian Peninsula, kind of competing with the Papacy in theory, because on those grounds, in fact, the historical outcome was kind of unavoidable, or at least we shouldn't even think like that. But let's say you would have had this whole part of Europe kind of shifting towards another direction and kind of sclerotizing a dichotomic opposition to, at that point, really to the Catholic Church. And this was not the first time that happened, right? The competition between the historical regions, or properly churches, was already a big deal, right? The Roman Church wasn't the sole one that could emerge properly as the ruling one over Christendom. It was, if you want, that was an anomaly, even within the same church, broadly meant, right? It was something really innovative, and even though Rome had already acquired that kind of thing, but think about the councils of Toledo that claimed an ecumenic character from there. I mean, everybody kind of does what they think it will simply aggrandize them. In a dramatically dimension of political fragmentation, like the high medieval one, right? It's obvious that these autonomistic tendencies are kind of easier than kind of unitary thought. So the unitary thought, in my opinion, has to be regarded as even more highly, and especially as a force that, being in fact non-obvious and actually the least obvious in this sense, is even more, it's more morally superior, because without that moral force, the greater moral force, it could have never succeeded. And so you have to explain, if you're antagonistic to that, why also that moral force was shared by was enough. Like, so many people sided with that, and eventually the Cathars failed and heresy was put down. Because again, it was not just the Pope saying that, it was not just the King of France saying it, it was also lots of people that were frankly fed up with all these movements that sometimes were also nothing but brigandage, right? That it is true that even in the literature, especially in the 12th century, 30s, all these preachers that were often agitators, and as such they were often said, okay, these are brigands, they have armed people. So in the official documents in councils, they were always stigmatized as kind of outlaws and violent and so on. But in 12th century Europe, if you think about the Brabançons, these other literally bands of mercenaries or that roamed Europe, killing, sacking, raping, and so on, were very often actually siding with these other movements, where there were often their armed wings. And so everything is hopelessly intertwined for us not to be able to provide like kind of a just radical explanation, like divide, like this was like this and this was like that. But exactly because it's all intertwined, you can easily see how close these things were and how much they overlapped also in many situations. So no, we cannot just talk about some sort of the Cathars in terms of somebody who dared to say something new, just as a new idea that was repressed just because of religious obscurantism, fanatism. It was objectively like a fracture within a very violent world, which was trying to kind of order itself in a moment where great opportunities arose, and that fierce competition ended up with the victory of at that point, who was more advantaged, but also was more able actually to exploit the situation because of the tools that it was endowed with, and that were created also along the way. And it took a long time, right? It took a century basically to put an end to this effect. Not but to Catharism, let's say, that even lasted longer, but probably the more consistent movement as such, and how to cope with that in a world where literally there is no state. And that's why the result is amazing, right? So we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.